Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first video on epidemiology. This video is going to be about quantifying risk, and it's basically going to encompass all of the things on this page of first aid, which is odds ratio, relative risk reduction, attributable risk, absolute risk reduction, number needed to treat, number needed to harm. And so when you look at all this and this entire page, you're going to ask me, how am I going to memorize all this? Well, it's actually not as hard as you think. And most of this stuff here in the center of the page, you don't have to memorize. You just have to memorize the left and the right column, and you'll be able to get probably 50% or more of the questions on step one correct just by memory of epidemiology, just by memorizing the left and the right-hand side of this page. So when you see a question at the end of which it asks you for number needed to harm, number needed to treat, or any of these values, you're going to pause, and you're going to, first thing you do is make this chart right here. So at the top of the page, of the first aid page, you're going to see this chart here. You're just going to recreate it. I'll tell you how to do it because it matters where you put A, B, C, D, and where you put disease or outcome and exposure or intervention. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go left to right, up to down, and write A, B, C, D in this order. Once you've done that, well above the A, B, and C, D, you're going to put the disease. And keep in mind that the disease is what actually happens in real life. So this is what happens to the patients that are being studied. This is the outcome or the reality. And to the left, well to the left, so you leave adequate room for these two things here, you're going to put exposure. And the exposure is basically what the researchers are going to be doing to the study participants. And we'll have an example at the end of this video so you can practice doing this yourself. And then after you've done that, you're going to put plus and minus from left to right and from up to down, above and below, above and to the left of this table. So one thing that may be slightly confusing is when you put plus for disease, this is actually the bad outcome. Even though we associated plus with a good thing, plus for disease is a bad outcome. And minus for disease is a good outcome. The reason why I emphasize this is because sometimes they'll give you the number of years survived or an outcome that is not automatically good or bad. And in your mind, you have to make it good or bad. But the good outcome is with the minus sign and the bad outcome is the plus sign. So just be conscious of that. And then at the end, you're going to fill in the numbers that you see in the question stem after you have this entire table filled out. And then once you've done that, now you're going to write down the formula that you have to use to get any of these values. So if you look at the left side of the table, and I took this straight out of first aid. So this is the left side, right? Just odds ratio, relative risk, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at the left side, you're going to see a pattern. You're going to see OR, RR, 3 R's, then AR, ARR, then number needed to treat and number needed to harm. And these bottom two, you don't really have to memorize the order, and I'll explain why in a bit. So if you just say this quickly in your head and then write this down a few times, you're going to remember it. And in fact, right now, I want you to take out a piece of paper, pause this video, and write this down a few times, and you'll see that it's not as hard to remember as you might think. And then once you've done that, on the right side, you're going to write down these values. And this looks crazy to remember, but it's not as bad as you think. So the first one for odds ratio, OR, it's AD over BC. And if you think about A, B, C, D, all these letters in a row, you're going to take the outside letters, A and D, at the end of the word, at the end of the string of letters, A and D, and you're going to multiply them. And then you're going to take the innermost letters, B and C, and you're going to multiply them and divide the outermost letters by the innermost letters and put them on top of each other like that and divide them. So that's where you get AD over B and C. Now for RR, you get A over A plus B divided by C over C plus D. Now remember, from the first aid page, A over A plus B is going to be the top part of the column. It's going to be the left thing divided by both of these put together. So left divided by both of them put together. And then C over C plus D is the left thing divided by both of them put together. So that's how this is a little bit easier to memorize than you think. So you take the top of the table A over A plus B, and you divide it by the bottom of the table, C over C plus D. And then for 3 R's, you're just going to have the number 1 and minus 2 of the R's. So it's easy to remember this one. And then notice the D and E, like these letters over here. So for AR and ARR, instead of dividing, you're going to be subtracting. So just like you put up here, you're going to do the same thing, but there's a subtraction sign. And then on below that, you're going to do the opposite. So there's a subtraction sign, but you're going to flip them. So you're going to start with C and you're going to end with A. And then the bottom trick for number needed to treat, number needed to harm, is you remember that for harm has AR in it, AR. So for number needed to harm, it's 1 over AR, and number needed to treat, it's 1 over ARR. And if you remember that, this order doesn't matter, because if you look at these formulas over here, they're just inverses of each other. So if you multiply this formula by -1, you're going to get this formula. And if you're bad at math, just trust me, it works out. When you multiply something by -1 and you're subtracting, the two things just flip. And that's it. Now pause this video again, write all of this down and all of this down a few times until you've memorized this. And once you've done that, we'll go on to a practice question. And before we do that, there's actually one more high yield point that I actually encountered on my rotations recently. And we were doing a practice question with the residents, and the practice question was actually about epidemiology, and it was asking what kind of study you would use for, what kind of test you would use for a certain study. And so odds ratio and relative risk are really similar, give you really similar numbers in terms of logically what they mean. And if you look at first aid, odds ratio is typically used in case control studies. What this means is case control studies are looking from data that already exists behind, and relative risk is used in cohort studies. So you're going to use relative risk when you're planning a study for the future. So that's kind of the difference. If a step 1 question asks you about which method of quantifying risk is better for a case control study or a study looking back at data, you're going to use odds ratio. And for a study looking forward at data, you're going to use relative risk. Okay. So now after this, we're going to do a practice problem. And so pause the video and try to solve this problem. And then afterwards, we'll go through it together. Okay, so now that you've tried to solve this problem, the first thing I want you guys to notice is that the disease is on the left and the outcome and the intervention is above. So when you make the table, you essentially have to flip those two values, which might make this confusing. So your table should look like this. And these are the numbers that you should have filled in. After you filled in those numbers, you should have found that the formula they were asking for was number needed to harm, which is 1 over AR. Remember, harm is AR. And then after you plug all these values in, you should have gotten 40. And that's why the answer is C, 40. And that's it, guys. There's a bunch of questions like this on when you study for step 1. And there were a few like this on step 1 itself. And just having this method really helped me get them correct. And another thing you can do is right when you get your scrap paper and right when you begin your test, your actual step 1 exam, you can write down, you can draw this chart out. You can draw this chart out completely and write down the left and the right side of the columns of this page of first aid, so that you don't have to think of this later when your brain is already fried and you're like on your 4th block. Just write this down in the beginning so you never have to think about this again and just use this as a reference. That's it, guys. Good luck studying.